like to introduce to you all Dr. Brownson, who I remember when I was first thinking like, oh, we're gonna do a program for around MLK Day during Kindness Week. And I emailed Erin, I was like, I wonder if there's someone that we could, come by and maybe do a presentation on Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches. And then she was like, "Oh, I'd be so excited to do it myself because that's one of my favorite topics." So I'd like to welcome Dr. Brownson, who has nicely joined us, and I thank her for participating with us.
Thank you, Xander. Thanks to everybody else out there. I appreciate it. Thanks for letting me be a part of Kindness Week and continuing the thoughts and the legacy and the words of Dr. King. I became much more aware and certainly much more interested when I was doing my graduate work. And I had a course called The Rhetoric of Social Movements, and I was drawn to it. I was born when Dr. King was touring, making speeches, doing rallies and marches, but I was pretty young, so I have no firsthand knowledge, but maybe some of those in the audience do, or maybe our family members or friends. So I come to it from a communication scholarly background. I also come to it from my own perspective. So to me, it's just been a passion in what I've been teaching for, oh my gosh, 34 years, how communication can be a tool for good and how to combat when the communication is not so good. And I think one of the best examples we have are the teachings, whether through speech or writing, those messages of Dr. King. So I'm delighted to join you today. When Xander first expressed interest in having somebody from Carthage College come on and work with this programming, I've got to say that I was like, yes, I could find you somebody. It's me. And this is what I've been trying to incorporate in many of my classes, including a class on rhetoric and persuasion. So he said, we'd like someone who really can talk about the rhetorical power of his messaging and also what that means to us today. So let me find, there we go. So I'd like to talk about one particular message of Dr. King and break it down a little bit and how those messages can change the world, and they have that opportunity. So I'm going to be talking about what is called the Mountaintop Speech. Many more people are familiar with I Have a Dream or some other of his writings or speeches. This one has always struck a chord for me. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The Mountaintop Speech was delivered on Wednesday, April 3rd, 1968. This was the evening before he was assassinated. It was delivered at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, so that's why he was in Memphis. In large part, this address to the audience was in preparation and trying to gain support for a march that was planned for the following Monday, April 8th. The Mountaintop Speech and the audience members were primarily brought together because there was a strike going on. So sanitation workers were on strike about all sorts of unfair and unsafe work practices, particularly following the death of 2 workers in February, so a few months before this, and of course, over the rest of the continuing challenges. I think it's really significant to know the historical, social context in which this speech was delivered. It's a wee bit easier for us with hindsight to think about the historical context. Could he have known, could the listeners have known, could the organizers have known that this would be the last speech? No, but actually he does talk about that a little bit in this speech. The speech almost didn't happen, by the way. He was very sick on the night. And, but Reverend Abernathy, who you'll hear him referred to in a clip coming up, convinced him to rally the troops to move forward for the march on the following Monday. So I'd like to jump in and talk about this thing called rhetoric. And one of the founding forces of rhetoric is Aristotle. Here's one of my books from graduate school, right? The writings of Aristotle. And here's a simple definition of what rhetoric is: the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Okay. And I know sometimes today, especially in our culture, the term rhetoric might even be taken negatively, might be interpreted negatively. If you disagree with someone or their stance, oh, you're just taking a rhetorical position, right? That's not what Aristotle intended. Finding the available means of persuasion. Here's one more definition: the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. And I draw this definition from, I don't know, for better or worse, dare I say, maybe our philosophical counterparts in today's culture, Google. So you can find a lot more information if you just wanted to Google rhetoric, but it's all about the persuasion. Okay. I do want to jump in and just say at this point that I'm a teacher. That's what I do. I welcome, I encourage, I invite anybody to ask questions throughout. And certainly we can wait and do questions and discussion afterward. Xander and I will be trying to monitor the chat, but feel free to pop on your mic or put something in the chat if anybody has any questions. Because this is the point where in a classroom, I would say, okay, are we ready to move on? So I will. So let's talk a little bit about the rhetoric of particularly the Mountaintop Speech. As all good speeches do, they start with the beginning, and a strong beginning, as we have come accustomed, right, to expect from Dr. King. In his introduction, he acknowledges the host and who introduced him, and that's Reverend Abernathy. He acknowledges the audience members, who are by and large community members. They aren't all sanitation workers, but they're part of the community, right? So they have a stake in it. And he really sets the tone, okay? So I'm going to play you a little clip of the very opening of the Mountaintop Speech. You know, two things I wish. One, I wish we were in person so we could, you know, just meet each other and interact a little bit, but it is what it is, so we'll make the best of it. That's one of my wishes. The other wish is that we had more time. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the Mountaintop Speech, I believe the audio file has been made available. It is 43 minutes long and worth every second, if you ask me, but I would encourage you to listen to it if you can. I will say also that there was an audio recording of the speech, but there was no film and no video at the time, right? So we don't have in any archive a film of the presentation of the speech, but luckily we do have an audio recording. So on to that audio recording.
Thank you very kindly, my friends. As I listened to Ralph Abernathy and his eloquent and generous introduction, and then thought about myself, I wondered who he was talking about. It's always good to have your closest friend and associate to say something good about you. And Ralph Abernathy is the best friend that I have in the world. I'm delighted to see each of you here tonight in spite of a storm warning. You reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis, something is happening in our world. And you know, if I was standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt. And I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through a road across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the promised land.
Okay. So this sets the tone. He's making such comparisons and really evoking imagery for the audience. And so he's setting that up. So a good persuasive speaker, of course, recognizes the audience, what their purpose is, and alludes to certain things. And that last line of that little segment, we will revisit toward the conclusion, where he's particularly talking about the promised land. So the three rhetorical appeals that Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and everybody since refers to are logic, emotion, and ethics. And these are the ancient Greek forms of those words, logos, pathos, and ethos. So what I'd like to do is introduce each one of those and tell you what that means, and then share with you some examples from throughout the speech of how Dr. King was so effective at using these logical, emotional, and ethical appeals. One of the things that Aristotle said is that you're likely to have a diverse audience. Some people are more likely to be persuaded through logic. Some people are more likely to be persuaded by emotion. So you've got to be able to effectively tailor the message to try to cast as wide a net as possible. So let me talk a little bit about logos or logic. This is about using information that appeals to a person's intellect, right? The rational side of humans. It certainly relies on the speaker's ability, the audience's ability to process the evidence, the data, whatever's in there, in logical ways and draw their own conclusions. So let me share a couple examples with you. I believe that a transcript of the speech has also been provided. So again, I know that we just unfortunately don't have time to listen to everything, but I've indicated what those are by page number and paragraph number. So if you want to follow along or go back and check it later. So a couple examples that I pulled out that really struck me. These are logic, fact-based things that truly are unrefutable, right? He's talking about survival. So I'm pulling this from page 2, paragraph 6, for those of you playing at home. Basic survival, safety, food to eat for their families, a roof over people's heads, the right to have a job and be safe in that job, and to survive in a community. Those are basic survival principles. That's a logical argument. He also talks about the 1,300 sanitation workers who are striking. 1,300. Again, unrefutable facts. So he also talks about, like I was saying, the unsafe working conditions, including the deaths of some workers, unfair wages, and other discriminatory practices. Some more examples of logic. He also works into this current speech his experiences in Alabama, which some of you may know of, where he was talking about how particularly voting rights and the March to Selma over the Pettus Bridge, trying to do this nonviolent protest that was met with violence. And he talks about the kind of resistance and violence that the marchers and the workers and the ralliers were faced with, from being maced, being attacked with fire hoses, police dogs, arrests, etc. And what this is doing is it's creating a little bit more of the logical appeal, in that by pulling in these former historical events and what happened, again, these are facts, unrefutable. He pulls it in a little bit more currently to 1968, particularly talking about the injunctions. So they were having trouble getting permits to do this march, to do this protest. And that's a logical roadblock, right? And he talks about how that really can be counter, and was counter, to what he called, and I quote, well, I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, the supposed right to assemble. How can you have a constitutional right to assemble and not let people assemble, right? That's a logical argument, okay? Another very relevant logical argument that he talks about is the power of economic withdrawal and economic disparities in general. So he was talking about boycotts as have forever been pretty successful, no matter what the cause was about. Boycotting, he identifies specific companies who have been identified as having unfair hiring practices or other discriminatory actions or behaviors. And he's suggesting to the community that they take their money elsewhere and not support these boycotts. And again, these have been successful over centuries and around the globe. Also, putting your money where it might be helpful. This is another logical argument. And so he used the term bank in and insurance in. And he was suggesting that community members do their banking at a bank that supports those community members, particularly Black-owned, Black-operated banks, or, for example, insurance companies. And he says, why not take your insurance out with somebody who supports the community and everyone in the community, including the Black community? So by by talking about these economic means, this is again related to straight up survival, right? And there's power in economic means. So those are some examples of logos. Okay. Are there questions in the chat or anything? No, just checking. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. I just saw some numbers up there. Thank you. All right. Next, I'd like to talk about pathos. Again, pathos is appeals to emotions. So the persuader should assess what the emotional state is of the audience. And again, the audience is not just the sanitation strikers, but the community members, their families, their friends, the people they work with, the people they worship with, the people they go to the ball game with, right? It helps build that sense of community. And so a persuader wants to really appeal to what those people hold dear. So here's a couple examples. And again, this is my interpretation of his messages. On page 3, paragraph 1, excuse me, and this might harken back to that introductory paragraph we heard. He says, we are saying that we are God's children, and that we are God's children, we don't have to live like we are forced to live. This should evoke an emotional response. It is very much aligned with spiritual or religious symbolism, right? But also, when talking about God's children, and really anybody who is under, hopefully, the benevolent care and protection of some religious figure, this is what he's striving to have people understand, that there are plenty of people who need that protection and that support and the ability to take advantage of the rights they have or should be given. Following that, excuse me, just a little bit later in the speech, he brings up the particular children of God who are the sanitation workers who are on strike. And he says 1,300 of God's children are suffering, sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights, wondering how this is going to come out. What imagery there, right? It really pulls at the heartstrings. So again, we've got the, sure, 1,300, that's a logical number, but there's an emotional component to it. That's a lot of people. That's a community right there, right? And that, again, evoking children of God, and then talking about the suffering, the hunger, going through dark and dreary nights. What a wonderful image that paints. And by wonderful, I mean effective. Dark and dreary nights are not wonderful, but it's a wonderful use of that phrase. And then he also talked at the beginning, which we heard a little bit of an introduction to, that he is happy to live in this period. And in this, a little bit later toward the end, he brings up and discusses the previous assassination attempt by stabbing in 1958. And yes, this could be conceived as a logical appeal. These are facts. This is what happened. But I think it evokes his own experiences, violence toward him, threats toward him. It helps add to his story, his believability, and yes, to evoke certain emotions, because that's what a good persuader does. He also, throughout the speech, but particularly at the end on page 9, toward the end, he refers to those in the audience and those in the community as brothers and sisters. So now we've gone from a community to a family, and all the emotion that should and does come with that, right? So not only is there a community bond because we live in the same zip code, but a stronger, more personal, bonded connection, right? And so by using language like brothers and sisters, he's creating that familial context. Okay. And the third rhetorical appeal is that of ethos or ethics. So this appeals to the ethics. We look at the ethics of the speaker. We appeal to the ethics of the audience. We even look at the ethics of messages. But really, it's all about the audience's perception of the speaker's image, reputation, trust, and credibility. So here's an example that I think really illustrates his use of ethos in the Mountaintop Speech. He says, "And when we have our march, you need to be there. If it means leaving work, if it means leaving school, be there. Be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together." I realize my reading the text in no way is the equivalent of Dr. King's performance and delivery of the speech, but it's quite a small clip, so I decided to read it. What I love about this one segment is he's appealing to a person's sense of right and wrong, and that it takes sacrifice. And he's saying, if it means leaving work, if it means leaving school, you need to be there. And he says we need to be concerned about our brothers and our sisters, right? And so that's just a symbol for the greater community. And the attempt to invoke, again, community, unity, and a sense of obligation, that is an ethical appeal. Either we go up together or we go down together. He's pretty much laying the gauntlet right here, right? You're either with us or against us. We need you. Other examples of ethos throughout the speech, but particularly on page 3, talking about injustice. And then he says, I love this phrase, let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. Unselfishness, there's your sacrifice. There's your sense of obligation, right, to our brothers and sisters. Then he spends a good part of the speech relaying the parable of the Good Samaritan, which many of you may be familiar with. And that's a basic ethical principle. If you're unfamiliar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, this person needs help, and the super rich person doesn't help, and the super powerful person doesn't help. And then it's just this, average human who tries to help this other person who is downtrodden. And he turns that parable into the strike in Memphis among the sanitation workers. And this is where he's particularly giving what we call in persuasion the call to action, call for unity. The call to action, if persuasive messages are all around us, right? I mean, every commercial and advertisement is a persuasive message, but most of them end with a very clear call to action, right? Buy my product. Your life will be better if you buy my product or use my service. And so without action, nothing gets done, right? It's one thing to sit there and agree with each other, but agreement doesn't change the world. Action changes the world. So he makes his action very clear. Be there at the march, okay? And let's be there together. And so we heard in Aristotle's definition that a good persuader uses rhetorical devices. So again, this is language and other communicative things that are intended to have a positive effect on any audience. Excuse me. Okay, so I want to point out a few of those rhetorical devices. I think we would be hard pressed to find someone who does not think that Dr. King was an extremely charismatic communicator and charismatic leader. What does charisma mean? It means somebody who is assertive and passionate and knows how to use communication to achieve their goals, hopefully positive goals. And so we saw that in his leadership and in his presentation, also in his writings, if you ever get a chance to read, you know, like his letters from jail and some of his other works. Another thing that Dr. King used so effectively is his vocal delivery. It's no consequence that he most often sounds like a Southern preacher, because he was, right? And so he knew how to use his voice, how to use inflection or pitch changes, how to vary the volume, when to speak loudly, when to speak softly. And there is a rhythm, there is a cadence to much of his delivery that you're likely to hear in other speeches as well. I did read recently, and I cannot verify this, but I did read recently that he got a C in a public speaking class. Well, you know what? Everybody starts from somewhere, right? And through his education, especially his theological education, right? And becoming a pastor and honing those skills and working to inspire and lead people, we can improve our rhetorical skills as well. Another rhetorical device was the very strong opening that I played you a little clip of. A couple other rhetorical devices is his use of symbolism. And we see this throughout the speech. He talks a great deal in terms of religious and historical contexts. So again, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the history of the world. In fact, when we heard that little clip of the opening and he says, I would want to be here and I would want to be now, but then I'd like to go to Egypt and see God's children, you know, across the Red Sea. But let me just share with you where he goes with that. He said, I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus. And he talks a little bit about that. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man. He says, I would even go by the way that the man for whom I am named had his habitat. So he's talking about Martin Luther and his religious and historical significance. He said, I would come on up even to 1863 and watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion, and he talks about that. I would even come up to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of the bankruptcy of his nation. He's of course talking about FDR, right? Roosevelt. And strangely enough, this I'm still quoting, he said, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. And so he's using these historical and or religious contexts to again, create some imagery and create these visions in the mind of the listener. He's also a great user of metaphors and analogies and some other figures of speech. Another very effective and very useful rhetorical device he uses is repetition. Repetition. If any of you have ever seen, heard, or even read Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, you know the power of repetition. By striking those familiar chords and re-saying a phrase or coming back to the same theme, you have the opportunity to try to hammer it home repeatedly. And we know that this is effective for persuasion. If, again, if you don't believe me, listen to commercials. They repeat stuff over and over, right? Because they want people to remember it. And the same is true for great speeches like this. So if you've heard or seen I Have a Dream, you know that this is effective for him. And again, what is he repeating? He's repeating those religious historical examples that I was just talking about. Toward the end of the speech, he brings in one specific historical example, and that was the previous assassination attempt that I referred to earlier, that he referred to previously in the speech. And I want to play you a clip of that and listen to not only the repetition, but if you would, listen to the rhythm and the cadence of how he delivers these things, okay? And so I refer to this as the section on If I Had Sneezed. And let me play you an audio clip here.
But there was another letter.
Oh, I'm pausing just a second. So he had been talking about all of these letters that he got while he was still in the hospital and recuperating after the stabbing. He got letters from the president and the vice president, other political leaders, religious leaders, international leaders. People were pouring in the support. But now he's going to tell you about one particular letter that has stuck with him.
It came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. And I want to say tonight, that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960, when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream, and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961, when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation in interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962, when Negroes in Albany, Georgia, decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963. Black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation. brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And they were telling me.
Oh, sorry. So did you hear the rhythm that he took? And of course, he's got to pause, and he pauses for effect. Yes, gives the audience a moment to digest and think about what he's saying, but also pausing for the audience reaction. And you can hear the enthusiasm among the audience members, right? But I love the pacing. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been at blah, blah, blah. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have done this. If I had sneezed. And it's like he's taking the audience by the hand and just taking them through this historical journey with him. It also just adds to his credibility and record of activism, right? But I love the pacing of it, and certainly the repetition keeps bringing it and keeps it current, right? And at the surface. So I think that's a really great use of that. And again, we did see that used in I Have a Dream. A couple other things, particularly from that segment, that really struck me. His, again, imagery, symbolism, metaphors, when he was talking about the sit-ins, right? And maybe being at a diner, cafeteria, and the fact that, those people, I was going to say young people, but it wasn't just young people. The people who were doing that, they were sitting in, but they were standing up. What a powerful turn of a phrase, right? And the other one that really strikes a chord for me is when he talks that we should straighten our backs, right? Straighten up our backs, because you can't have somebody riding your back if your back is straight, right? It's such a moving, powerful image that he's creating. And again, he's evoking these emotional and ethical arguments and logic to try to gather more people for the march that was to happen the following Monday. Other rhetorical devices include the strong conclusion, again, restating the call to action, using the imagery. A good conclusion always relates back to the introduction, kind of ties it up in a nice, neat bow. So I'd like to play you the closing part of the Mountaintop Speech.
Now it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We're sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Gets me every time. I've heard this speech over 100 times and it gets me every time. Pardon me. Every time. Such imagery, such a use of the voice. And he was killed the next day. I do want to let folks know, in case they don't, that the Memphis March did take place on Monday, April 8th. It became a silent march of over 10,000 people led by the new widow, Mrs. King, and her children. Marched and then came to the speaking place, and Mrs. King spoke, and also Reverend Abernathy spoke. And Reverend Abernathy took up the reins and became the leader of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. And so that's interesting, and you can find the text of those speeches as well. And so what that makes me think of is, right, our current situation and how this rhetorical, powerful message is just as important today. And maybe we can not only learn lessons about fairness and justice and non-discrimination and non-violence, but also how the enduring messages and the legacy that he leaves can inform how we treat each other today. And so I would say, let's keep climbing that mountain together. Thank you.